Out for a walk in my neighborhood, a place that's familiar to me. Familiar is the prompt today on the RPG A Day 2019 challenge. And the thing that I want to talk about with familiarity, the idea of familiar, comes from Daniel McKay's book on fantasy role-playing as a performance art. He talks about this idea of cultural commodity. The more that a group of players understands the story world in which they're playing, the easier it will be for them to game in that world. And what I mean by this is if you were to play even Star Trek as a role-playing game with a bunch of Star Wars nerds, they would be more familiar with kyber crystals, those are the ones that go into the Jedi's lightsaber, than they would with dilithium crystals. And just those little differences make huge differences when it comes to getting player buy-in. Familiarity is important. Let's use another example. Take a look at my shirt. Wise. It's a Ravenclaw shirt. Now, Ravenclaw is one of the houses in the Harry Potter series, right? Like if someone's into fantasy, they might say, I'm into fantasy. Say like, what kind of fantasy are you into? Because if it's Harry Potter fantasy, that's awfully different than Forgotten Realms, as I learned about a year or so ago when I was running a gaming group for my kids. One of the players was having a really tough time with the fantasy world, and I was like, but you're in Harry Potter. And it occurred to me that, Harry Potter is nothing like the Forgotten Realms. So what it is, I changed the game and moved it to a more familiar space. I took the characters and put them in a magic school that doesn't exist in the canonical lore of the Forgotten Realms, but was essential for me to get that familiarity, that buy-in that a player can have when they understand the world better. I took this a step further. For the classmates at this school, I didn't go with Hermione and Harry and Ron, which felt a little too on the nose. I went with the Archie gang, and I found matching Pathfinder cards, and I assigned all of the different characters: Archie, Betty, Veronica, Jughead, Reggie, and Cheryl Blossom. I made all of these characters into their fantasy versions, and that familiarity, although my players didn't know that that's who they were, that familiarity helped us with a ton of shorthand. Everybody knew Reggie was a jerk without me having to really explain it. I just sort of played Reggie, Renaud, that's the medieval version of his name, as I think of Reggie being, and characters knew this guy's a jerk, and they knew that Betty, was someone they could trust, and they weren't quite sure about Veronica, because who's sure about Veronica? I'm talking old Archie, not Riverdale, folks. See, a person could want to play Dungeons and Dragons or a game like it because they're into Harry Potter or they're into Tolkien. You go, oh, well, Tolkien's an awful lot like Forgotten Realms, and in one sense it is, but a person who's read all of Tolkien's works, including the Silmarillion, still wouldn't know what a Yugoloth was. The old adage is that familiarity breeds contempt. But as far as being in a role-playing world, trying to act like a character that isn't you, I find that familiarity can be really helpful. One of my favorite examples of this was from playing a game called Tales from the Loop. I've already talked about this game in a previous post. It's one of my favorite role-playing games, both mechanically and in terms of the secondary world that you get to play in. But it takes place in a modern setting, a 1980s setting, if that can be considered modern anymore, although I think my kids would probably argue that this would have been better posted under the ancient header the other day. But the 1980s, that's something that is familiar. At least it was for my players when we played Tales from the Loop. And the buy-in was huge on the part of my players. They didn't have to ask me about elven culture. They didn't have to ask me about, like, what does an orc actually look like? Or how big is this dragon? Or what exactly does a gelatinous cube do? And why do people use it to clean dungeons? We were able to construct a fake town, a space that doesn't actually exist, but that was based upon all of our own hometowns. I actually took sections from each of our hometowns from Google Map and put it all together in Photoshop to create a map of this town that doesn't exist on the southern shores of Wabamun Lake. Even players who had never been to Wabamun Lake at least understood what a small Alberta town looks like. And so they were able to play the game with a greater sense of familiarity. The jump in, the buy-in was quicker, and we weren't, and if there was an exploration going on in terms of the world, it was where there was difference, where there was some dissonance, like a crazed cyborg janitor chasing you through the halls of your school. But familiarity can help players, and it's something that we need to be ready to be able to give them as a leg up. Especially with games that are very crunchy, the ones that have an awful lot of rules. Players don't need to be learning the entire monster manual as well. So create spaces of familiarity for your player. One more thought here at the end of the day occurred to me that a really great role-playing game for playing in a familiar space is Fantasy Flight's The End of the World series. You play as yourself. The game begins with the dungeon master dying or being, eliminated by whatever force is ending the world. And they have a couple different books for this. The zombies can end the world, the gods can end the world, the machines can end the world, or in this case, aliens. So I played this once on a car trip with my kids, and as we drove, we were playing the game, and I would point out stuff, and I'd say that there were giant ants over there, and they would spot a vehicle that we should hotwire and take because it was better than ours, and stuff like that. And so it was a ton of fun. So pull your players, find out what worlds they're familiar with, and then bring your gaming alongside of that, at least to begin with. It's a great way for them to get their feet wet, to get their sea legs under them, whatever metaphor you want to choose that has something to do with making people familiar with this incredibly unfamiliar world that you're adventuring in.